Path to a hyperinflation endgame that nobody is talking about. You definitely need to sit down and buckle up for this one for sure. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the government debt problem. I've got a chart of government spending and revenue to GDP. Starts at 1930, goes all the way to 2010. We're going to take it beyond 2010 in just a moment. On the left, it goes from 0% to 40% of GDP. The black line, federal government spending. Blue, federal government revenue. Red, state and local spending. The green line, state and local revenue. Starting in 1930, federal government spending right around 3 to 4% of GDP. Wouldn't that be nice if we could go back to those days? It goes up, skyrockets, World War II, comes back down, flatlines all the way till we get to the GFC. Notice it goes up substantially. And we need to understand that now, especially in the last 10 years, that we have this Keynesian mindset in the government central banks with quantitative easing, artificially low interest rates, stimulus packages. When we go into a recession/depression, now the government spending goes through the roof. More on that in just a moment. The blue line represents the federal government revenue. So it starts off, goes up slightly, then pretty much flatlines. We have a little bit of an uptick there in the late 1990s because of the internet boom, but it comes back down. The main thing I want you to notice with this chart is the blue line is always under the black line. All right? In other words, the revenue is always lower than the government spending. It's the exact same thing in the states. Starts off in 1930, state spending about 10% of GDP. It goes back down actually in World War II, but then it comes back up at flat lines. Notice the green line always under the red line. So basically, over the past 80 or 90 years, government spending has always been higher than the government revenue they're collecting in taxes. That doesn't end well. So we understand what the problem is. The solutions would be to either decrease spending or increase revenue. Well, we can go ahead and cross this right off the list. Because there's no way they're going to decrease spending, that's for sure. So how would they increase revenue? The first thing would be economic growth. But what most people don't realize is the size of the private sector compared to GDP has shrunk dramatically. Let's think about this. Back in 1930, the private sector was about 90% of GDP. So just imagine it as this large circle. But now in 2010, and it's even worse today, but back in 2010, when you combine the state and local spending with the federal spending, government spending as a total was about 40% of GDP. In other words, the private sector was only 60%. So the size of the private sector, in other words, the engine for economic growth, has continually shrunk and shrunk and shrunk over the years. So now you're trying to squeeze more blood out of a smaller and smaller turnip. So this is why it would be very difficult for us to achieve the economic growth needed to actually service the staggering amounts of debt. And let me just explain this a slightly different way, take it to an extreme to make sure we're all on the same page. Let's think about an economy that had $1 of debt, or a government that had $1 of debt, and an economy that was generating $100 a year. The economy would only have to grow by 1% to satisfy the debt. But if we have an economy, or if we have a government that has $100 in debt, and the economy, the private sector, only produces $1 a year, think about how much this economy has to grow to satisfy this amount of debt. You see, it's far easier when the economy, the private sector, is a larger portion of GDP. And for another thought experiment, we can just think about if private sector was 100% of GDP, how easily could that grow to pay off debt compared to if the private sector was 0% of GDP? Obviously, if it's at 0%, it doesn't produce anything. It doesn't generate any tax revenue. So if the starting point is the private sector accounting for 100%, the closer you get to the private sector being 0% of GDP, the harder it becomes for growth to even service the existing debt, let alone pay it down. Oh, but wait, there is more. In fact, this time, there is a lot more. So now we're past 2010. We're going into a recession/depression with the cerveza sickness. So what's going to happen to tax receipts? They're going to completely plummet. What happens to government spending? It goes through the roof. So with all these trillion-dollar deficits and stimulus packages, government spending is going to go Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond. It's the exact opposite of solving the problem. Government spending, instead of going down, goes straight up, and government revenue, instead of going up, is going straight down. The problem is not getting better. It's going to get a whole heck of a lot worse. But my main point is if we're going into a recession or a depression, there's no way we can get any economic growth by definition. Another thing most people never really consider is if GDP goes down by a certain percentage, it's got to go back up by a higher percentage to get to the same high watermark. Check this out. I'll give you an example. If we start at 20 trillion in GDP, because of a recession depression, we go down by 50%. Now we're at 10 trillion. If all the Keynesians get in there, do all their quantitative easing, artificially low interest rates, stimulus, who knows what they do. Let's say we have this artificial boom, so GDP goes back up by 50%. We don't go back up to 20 because now we're at 10. If we increase by 50%, now we're only at 15 trillion. We're still $5 trillion lower in GDP than when we started, although we increased by the same percentage that we went down to begin with. And I'm sure right now your friend and family member Fred is saying, yeah, George, I get what you're saying, but we could always just increase taxes. Let the wealthy pay their fair share. Okay, let's look at the data and see what actually happens when you increase the highest marginal tax rate. Going back to our chart, we see that tax revenue has pretty much stayed the exact same all the way to the late 90s. So we then have to look at tax rates, the highest marginal rate. And most of us know that back in the 50s and 60s, it was 90%. And throughout the mid 80s, it drops down to around 28%. So again, during this time frame, we have a 90% highest marginal rate. During this time frame, we have a 28% highest marginal rate. But you'll notice the tax revenue coming into the government really doesn't change at all as a percentage of GDP. Why? Because at a certain point, people just won't pay it. They'll figure out a way around. But even if they were willing to pay the taxes, it doesn't matter. Because if you increase the tax burden on the private sector, you're going to be decreasing economic output. And if you continue to decrease economic output, no matter how high you raise the taxes, you're just exacerbating the problem. Let me explain it to you this way. If we start off with the economy, the private sector economy, generating $2 at a 30% tax rate, you're generating 60 cents in revenue. But if because you increase taxes, GDP of the private sector or economic output goes down to $1, even though you increase the taxes to 50%, you're still only getting 50 cents in revenue. So you start with 60 cents and now you're down to 50 cents, although you've increased taxes. Oh, time out. I actually found a picture online that I think illustrates this beautifully. The gentleman in the picture represents the government. The donkey represents the private sector. And just like when you increase taxes, when you increase the burden the donkey has to pull, the donkey's going to get slower and slower and slower until it gets to a certain point when it stops altogether. Just like the private sector economy. If you burden it with more and more taxes, it's going to get slower and slower and slower until it gets to a point, just like the donkey, where it stops altogether. The third option would be they can go ahead and default. Of course, this creates an economic collapse that would be equivalent to Armageddon, so they're definitely not going to do that. So what's our fourth option? I think you already know it. It would be inflation, or even better for the government debt load, hyperinflation. Step number 2, M2 money supply and velocity. We know the only way out for the government in their massive debt problem is through inflation. So how do they get from point A to point B? Let's explore M2 and velocity a little further so we can kind of get our heads around it and start connecting the dots. I've got a chart of velocity of M2 money supply going back to 1980. It actually goes back further, but I wanted it to match up with M2 money supply, so we're just taking it back to this year. It goes all the way to 2020. This is a recent chart. On the left, we go from 1.3, 2.2. That's how fast it turns over. 1980, we're right around 1.9, goes down a little bit, comes way up for the dot-com, the internet. We really had the money circulating throughout the economy. Then we have the recession, and we start quantitative easing, dropping interest rates artificially low. The velocity goes down, down, down to where it is today at an all-time low. It was at an all-time low prior to the cerveza sickness, but now it's tanked even further. M2 money supply. On the left, we go from 2 trillion up to $20 trillion. Pretty much a consistent line all the way up until we get to today, the cerveza sickness, where it basically goes vertical. So the question becomes, how has the money supply increased this much, and why has velocity decreased by that much? Because that's the key. If velocity would have stayed the same as it was in the 1990s, and they would have increased M2 money supply this much, we definitely would have got some serious, serious inflation, if not the hyperinflation. So to understand this, it goes back to the Fed and the primary dealer banks, the banks under their umbrella. The Fed can come in through quantitative easing and increase the bank reserves. They can double the bank reserves. They can quadruple the bank reserves. It doesn't really matter because the commercial banks actually have to take an action for these bank reserves to do something. If the commercial banks don't take an action, then the bank reserves just sit at the Federal Reserve and don't really serve a purpose at all. So there's a couple main things they can do. They can buy financial assets with these bank reserves, so then the bank reserves are just transferred from one bank to the next and just swapped for other financial assets, or they can create new loans, because as these bank reserves increase, it expands the capacity of the bank's balance sheet. In other words, it gives them more freedom and flexibility to create additional loans. If they create new loans in the real economy, that increases the M2 money supply. A lot of people struggle with this concept. So let me give you an example that hopefully will paint a clear picture. Let's say I gave you $1 million right now, but the stipulation is you couldn't spend the $1 million. The only thing you could do with the $1 million is lend it out, and then the profit that you made from lending it out, you could keep. If you lost money from lending it out, then you go bankrupt. So even if you have the $1 million in your account, it's just like these bank reserves. Unless you can find a productive way to create additional loan that will bring you profit, the $1 million doesn't matter because you can't access it. You can't really do anything with it. It's the exact same way with the Federal Reserve when they create bank reserves for the primary dealer banks, the commercial banks, and the banks under the Fed's umbrella. That's the best example I think I can give. And I want to be very clear. I'm not saying the banks lend out the bank reserves. They just use them as a backstop for additional loans. It's just with the example I gave, it's much easier to understand if I said I'm giving you $1 million that you can actually lend. So again, it goes back to this problem the Fed has with velocity, and they don't really have total control over the money supply. So why does the velocity go down? Why have we seen it go from this peak in the mid-1990s and continue to go down and down and down as the Fed does more and more quantitative easing? One possible explanation could be that when the primary dealer banks create new loans, now because they think there's a Fed put, they're only creating new loans for the financial economy. So let's think this through. We've got three participants: hedge fund Hank, saver Steve, and everyone's favorite, Moody the millennial with their blue hair. Notice I said their because I don't know Moody's preferred pronouns. Anyway, the banks go to hedge fund Hank and say, Hank, we will give you all the money you need to speculate in the markets and go into the repo market, do whatever you want. So hedge fund Hank's bank account goes from this size all the way up to this size. Well, saver Steve, he really doesn't do anything, so his bank account stays the same. Moody the millennial, now they spend money really quickly. As soon as they get that paycheck, boom, it's gone. They're not saving a dime. So their bank account has actually gone down. You see, the only velocity of money, the only circulation we have is through Moody the millennial. Because Hank has so much money, he's only spending a small fraction of it on rent, his car insurance, his food, etc. So you have this scenario where M2 money supply increases dramatically, but the velocity of the money supply slows down. And you may be saying to yourself, well, George, it's a simple solution. All we have to do is raise the taxes on hedge fund Hank. We can distribute the money over to Moody Millennial. They'll go out and spend it with more velocity. Problem solved. But what you're not thinking through is that transfer of purchasing power doesn't increase the amount of goods and services in the real economy. In fact, going back to step number one, it'll most likely shrink the amount of goods and services available, which would increase inflation that much more. So what you're really doing is you're not screwing over hedge fund Hank, even if he did pay the taxes. What you're doing is you're screwing over saver Steve, because the inflation hurts him just as much, if not more, than it would benefit Moody the millennial. So you now understand why it's really hard for the Fed to directly control M2 money supply. And it's almost impossible for them to control velocity. But you may be saying to yourself, if you're really paying attention, but George, the M2 money supply right here has gone completely parabolic. It's almost going vertical. So how is the velocity going down if the Fed isn't really controlling this vertical increase of M2 money supply? Number one, how is it growing? And then number two, why is velocity decreasing even faster? Let's go over here to explore it further. The government comes in with your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam and spends money like it's going out of style. They're draining it down onto the economy through stimulus checks and massive amounts of deficit spending. So that's why you're seeing M2 go up directly. Because the government, when they spend money into the economy, it goes directly into M2 money supply. It's a lot different than the Federal Reserve just creating these bank reserves where they have to depend on the commercial banking system. So they're creating deposits in the real economy. But what's happened is they can't control behavior. So the savings rate has gone through the roof. That's slowing velocity down while M2 is going parabolic. So the main takeaway from step number 1 and 2 is the government has to have inflation, but in order to get inflation, they have to increase velocity, and neither the Fed or the government has control of that velocity. Step number 3, the end game. This is the path to inflation or even hyperinflation. I think the Fed and the government could take us all down in the future. This is how it would work. The Fed comes out with their own coin. We'll call it the Fed coin. It's this wonderful invention that will put money right into your back pocket. Helicopter money, UBI. It's the freedom dividend that you deserve. So the Fed comes out with their own digital currency. And of course, what does Hank, Saver Steve, Moody the Millennial, and you sitting at home watching this video, to get the Fed coins, you have to download the Fed app. As you know, whenever the government gives something a title, the end result is always the opposite of whatever the title is. So this is the Fed app, but we're going to call it the Freedom app because it gives you your freedom dividend. So now the Fed can get money supply directly into the real economy. They don't have to worry about that crazy banking system. All you have to do is download your Freedom app to your iPhone, and every single month the Fed sends you, Hank, Steve, and Moody, let's say $1,000. Well, you could be saying to yourself, George, but we could take the $1,000, maybe we could deposit it into our bank account, and you'd have the same dilemma. They can't control human behavior. These individuals could save the money, and velocity could continue to go down, and the government won't get the inflation/hyperinflation they need to reduce this massive debt load. But since they're downloading it to the app, what the Fed and the government now have control over is how fast the individuals receiving the Fed coins actually spend the money. Since this is all digital, what the Fed or the government could do is say, yes, guys, we're giving you $1,000, but you have to spend it within 30 days. And if you don't, poof, it's gone. It's no longer on your Freedom app. So that increases velocity because these people now have to spend it in a certain amount of time or they lose the purchasing power. And then you start to see inflation tick up. Well, the government loves that, but let's say inflation isn't high enough for the government yet. They're still spending more money than is coming in somehow. Well, all they need to do is send you 3,000 Fed coins per month instead of 1,000. And then what they could do is say, now we're sending you 3,000 Fed coins, but you only have 15 days to spend it. That increases velocity even more. And if that's not enough inflation, now you only have 5 days to spend it. And if that's not enough, if they really want hyperinflation, boom, done deal. We'll give you 5,000 Fed coins, but you only have 1 day to spend them. And for all you people watching this video right now, saying, well, my gosh, I would love to have 5,000 Fed coins or $5,000, whatever they're called, wired directly to my bank account. But one thing I want to remind you is the number in your bank account doesn't necessarily equal purchasing power. As an example, I've got currency here from Colombia, where I am right now. This is a 50,000 peso note. Purchasing power, about 12 US dollars. It doesn't matter how many zeros are on this random piece of paper. it doesn't necessarily give you purchasing power. And it would be the exact same with these 5,000 Fed coins. I can assure you that if the government goes this route of the Fed coin, the Freedom app, and then increasing velocity to bail out your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, the number in your bank account may increase, but will have an economic collapse. Your purchasing power will also collapse, just like it did in Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.